their lesson, Tim Junkins.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Got a packed house today. I'm kind of liking this. I can get used to this level of noise. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yeah, right. I'm excited now. I was excited a few minutes ago, but I'm still excited. Just want to let you guys know that. A couple of months ago, I did a sermon on the concept of pass and fail and how thin that line can be. Just the idea of how close people have come in past works to like not making. The example I used was George Lucas and the Star Wars movies. Now they almost never really came to be what they were today as like we view them. I have a kind of extension as the opening anecdote for today's lesson. I was reading a different book where the author was talking about how she had gone to California. She had gone to a place called Skywalker Ranch, which is this place that George Lucas built, where it's just got like all the memorabilia, like just every like props and sets and like knickknacks and things like that. And this author had gone for a public tour. It's a place that you can tour publicly, but the person who was giving the tour recognized her. She's not a huge celebrity, but she's a minor celebrity. And the person recognized her and said, "Oh, I love your work. I love when you, let me give you like the kind of like behind the scenes tour." And so like she gets a private tour of the facility and she gets to like walk up and really examine the items and the props and their historical significance. She comes up to this one item and she looks at it and she goes, "This item looks really weird and I don't recognize it. What is it?" And the guy goes, "Oh, that's really cool. That's from the movie Return of the Jedi. There's the bit where the rebels have to break into this station and they have to blow it up in order to knock down the shield and save the galaxy, basically." And what's really interesting about this, and the reason she brings it up in her book, is she's talking about the idea of our ability to create as people, like how creative we are as people. And so I actually left this in the bag, but that's fine. But the person with like white rubber gloves takes this prop like explosive, and he shows it to her, and she examines it. And he flips it around, and mind you, this is the thing that saved the galaxy. Like they had to like knock out this thing so they could blow up the Death Star so they could save the galaxy. So do you know what saved the galaxy in 1983 in Return of the Jedi? It was a Dixie cup. The guy, very carefully, because this is technically a prop and it's technically worth a lot of money now, and he spins it around and he shows her the underside of the prop, and there, written along the words, just says the word Dixie. It was a Dixie cup. Those things are worth like a penny, if even that. And so it was this really interesting concept of that. And so the story behind it was that towards the end of filming the last movie, George Lucas was like, he ran out of funding from the studio. The studio wasn't still 100% sold on what Star Wars was going to become, so he was funneling his own money into the project. And he was like just trying to come up with ways to create props and aliens and sets and things like that. And he came up with this idea of taking these Dixie cups and turning them into props. And the idea that something increases in value from what is essentially less than a penny to thousands of dollars, because it's now a part of cinematic history, it's now a prop, is just this astounding concept. And the reason I wanted to talk about this morning is because we're approaching Thanksgiving week, so hooray for everybody, because for the most part we're all off on Thursday. So, you know, like there's a lot of things I'm thankful for. Being off Thursday, it's pretty high on that list. But one of the things I thought about is I want to talk about the idea of Thanksgiving today, and I wanted to thank God for the challenges that we have in life. There it is. Tim's lost his mind. He's off his rocker. What's he talking about? Thanking God for the challenges. Thanking God for the strife. Thanking God for the hard times. I don't know about that, Tim. Maybe I can't get behind that idea. But it's one of those things that when we look at the idea of what giving thanksgiving to God means, like what that actually means, is the idea that we are thankful to God in all times of our life. And it's such a hard concept to get behind. And ultimately one that when we are going through strife, I can guarantee you, in 1982, when he's running out of funding for the movie, and he has to put his own funding into the movie, George Lucas was not necessarily thankful for the opportunity to have to create his own props and things like that. But that story that comes out of it, that in hindsight is an amazing story. Because ultimately it demonstrates our ability as people to create. Thanksgiving is one of those really great times of year for that. Because we've all had those situations where things go wrong. During a Thanksgiving meal, during a Christmas meal, when we're having people over, there's ultimately some kind of hiccup that's going on. And we've got to figure out a way to power through that and to do workarounds and get through that. And our ability as people, even though we're not designing multi-million-dollar movies, in our own sense, we have this ability to adapt to situations. I think one of the most prevalent examples is at work. We find that a lot. Those of us who work with groups or alone or whatever it may be, we enter problem-solving situations. How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to figure it out? Are we going to have to put our own time into it, our own money? Are we going to have to coordinate with people? What are we going to do to get through this situation together? And then ultimately, at the end of that, we're thankful for the experience. Because we might have learned something new along the way. We might have figured out something new about ourselves. We might have learned a new tactic that will help us out later in life. What we're going to be reading from today is we're going to be reading from two different Psalms today. The first one is going to be from Psalm 95, and the second one is going to be Psalm 100. We're going to talk about the idea of how do we as Christians have a thankful attitude in times of strife, in times of crisis. How do we learn from that? How do we get through that? How do we change as people ultimately? So the first one we're looking at is Psalm 95, starting in verse 1. Psalm 95, starting in verse 1. O come, let us sing songs of praise. O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God, and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The height of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. This first verse just talks about the idea of understanding the position of authority that God is in our lives. And I've talked about this in past sermons, the idea that we as Christians worship a God who created the universe, who shaped the planet. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. A God lovingly created the world that we live in. And so ultimately, one of the things I've talked about in past lessons is the idea that we have to accept this as a reality in our lives. That God is not a parable. God is not a fable. God is not a mythological creature. God is not a storybook character. God is real. God is a God that we worship. He is the Father who sent his Son to die on the cross for our sins. He is the one who shaped the world, who shapes the events of the world that we live in. And so ultimately, it's one of those things that when we examine our situations in life, when we look at the strife and the trouble and the circumstances that we go through, and regardless of what they are, whether it's a singular event or whether it's a period of time that goes on over years or even decades, that it is one of those things that ultimately time passes and we are able to get through these situations. That there are things that we struggle with, there are things that we have in our lives this very second that we are struggling to deal with. And when I'm talking up here and I'm talking about the concept of how do we be thankful for those times, how are we thankful for the strife and the anguish and the tears and the misery and the time we have to sink into it and the time lost. Because ultimately for us, for people, time is a currency. It is a limited currency that we have in our lives. And so for those of us who work excessively or have family responsibilities or any other responsibilities that we may have, social, work, otherwise. It is one of those things that when we notch out those precious, precious times during the day where we can stop and we can reflect and we can cool down and we can kind of relax a little, time becomes a very valuable commodity. And how do we spend it? How do we spend it? Some days I get home at the end of the day and I lie on the couch and I stare at the TV for a couple hours because I'm recharging. There are some days that I get home and I'm social and I'm interacting with people. But it's one of those things that ultimately time is a currency. And so like, how do we wind up spending it? And it becomes so important to us that we begin to kind of dread working up to it, or we dread trying to get through it. And it's one of those things where when we're stuck in bad situations, it interrupts our time of like happiness. It interrupts our connection that we have with God. And so in verse 2 here, in the first psalm that we're reading, it says, "Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods." It's one of those things where this passage does not quantify the time in which we are to be thankful for God. We are to always be thankful for God. We are to always have thanksgiving in our heart, or we are to always try to have thanksgiving in our heart. Because ultimately, we as people know that we are incapable of having that attitude all the time by ourselves. I've got a lot of great tricks up my sleeve that I've learned over the years of calming myself down and powering through situations and trying to gain perspective. But ultimately, all of that falters without the power that God grants me. I, as a person, am limited in my ability. Flipping over to Psalm 100. And we're just going to go ahead and read the 5 verses there. Psalm 100. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name, for the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. This is important because the Psalms were written so long ago that it is a quantifiable time that is hard enough for us to understand. Because I kind of don't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, let alone remembering documents that were written generations ago. But there's an emphasis here that his steadfast love endures forever and his faithfulness to all generations. To all generations. That means that God doesn't have a punch-out time. God doesn't have a time where he stops being God. God doesn't have a 401k or a retirement plan or any of those concepts that we work towards as people. There's an important emphasis here in the second verse where it says, "Serve the Lord with gladness, come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God, it is he who made us and we are his." It's one of those things where the word gladness is such an important point to hammer on. The idea that we as people should be glad in our faith, that there should be a joy, that though there are times where, obviously there is a time for everything. There is a time for anger and there is a time for mourning. There is a time for all these different emotions that we go through. But the general attitude that we have to have with God is that we should be glad that we worship him. That should be an emotion, a presence in our hearts constantly. It's one of those things that whenever I have been disconnected from that, whenever I've been miserable or angry or I have lost perspective or I'm frustrated with the circumstances that are before me, it is always because I have put God aside. And not that I have specifically said, "God, I am done with you," but just that I have not paid him his due. That I have not stopped and reflected. back when I was in high school, the WWJD bracelets were really kind of like the fad. And like it was cute, and they were bracelets, and it was just like it was a thing. But it does ask an important question. That if we really stop and ask that question, it gives us the ability to kind of focus on what would Jesus really do in a circumstance like this. And so it's one of those things where when we look at the Psalms, especially Psalm 100, Psalm 100 is famously known for being used in worship services as a statement of thanksgiving to God. That we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name, for the Lord is good. There are a lot of different examples in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, talking about the idea of who we need to be as people. You can look at Philippians and the idea of pressing on towards the goal. You can look at other passages talking about trials and tribulations and works and faith and things like that. And just the idea that we as people have this attitude of thanksgiving for God. That it is something that we can be, that there are times in our life. Because like most things in life, Jesus always talked about the idea of, being nice to your friends and your family and your neighbors. That's something even the pagans can do. I say pray for your enemies. And Jesus always talked about these concepts of doing things that are so kind of outside the box. And so what I wanted to kind of really focus on today is the idea of being thankful for kind of the odd things in life. Being thankful for the circumstances, for the experiences that shape us as people. That there are negative things in my life that changed my course, that made me re-examine things, that changed me as a person, that got me to where I am today. And so, in what sounds like a really odd sense, I'm thankful for those experiences. I am thankful for the opportunities where I have failed. And I'm thankful for the opportunities where I have learned from those failures. Because ultimately, all of that is built on the idea of experience. The idea that we as people are shaped by the experiences, both good and bad. And so when we sit down Thursday night, traditionally, families, people on social media and things like that, they do the week of Thanksgiving or the month of Thanksgiving, where they go on every day for a week or a month and they talk about what they're thankful for. And they're all very great things, and I'm not discounting that. I've got to get ahead of the curve here and say that. And so the people who say, I'm thankful for my family, of course I'm thankful for my family. And I'm thankful for my job, and of course I'm thankful for my job. And I'm thankful for all of the good and the great and the wonderful things in my life. Of course I'm thankful for those things. But just, even if it's a simple sentence, even if it's something that you just stop for the briefest of moments on, thank God for the experience that got you to where you are today. Because we are not shaped solely on the experiences of good. That my entire life has not been perfect, and everything has gone my way, and everything works out. Because that is not the experience that any of us have as people. And so in Psalm 100, it really makes you examine the concept of serve the Lord with gladness, come into his presence with singing. And in the one before that, talking about making a joyful noise for the Lord. Because it's easy to do that when we're in the moment of happiness. It's easy to do that when things are going right and we're off work and we're relaxing with family and we're sitting around and we're eating food and we're watching football and that's pretty much all Thursday is, right? It's just eating food and watching football. But when we have those moments of relaxation, of course, when I was going to college, it was the easiest thing in the world to be a Christian. I went to Bible classes every day. I went to chapel every day. I had theological conversations with my fellow students, with my professors. It was church every day of the week. And it was so easy. And it was so great, and it was so wonderful, and I loved the time that I had there. But then you get out in the world, and you're like, oh, I'm not dealing with Christians day to day anymore. And and the experiences I'm having are outside of this protective bubble. And so, like inside of holidays and churches and things like that, it is so easy to have thankfulness in your heart. And so what I ask you to do, the Tim Junkins point of the sermon that he is talking about of the week, I got to work on a better name for that. But the point that I really want to hammer on is the idea that thankfulness can be in your heart when things are not going well. That joy and singing a song to the Lord can be in your heart when things are not going great. In short-term problems, in long-term problems. That God is willing to be with us. If we look at Psalm 95 and we really believe that God shaped the world, that He made the oceans and He shaped the land and He gave us a place to live and He gave us lives to lead, if we truly, ultimately believe that in our hearts, then we can strive to be better in our daily lives. Are we going to hit it all the time? Absolutely not. Is it going to be easy all the time? No, of course not. But it's something that if you can notch out a little more thankfulness in your heart, if you can notch out a little more joy in your heart, then there is no room for misery and anger and strife and sadness. And so that's the struggle. That's the thing that we deal with as people. Looking back at Psalm 95, for the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. Into His hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountain are His also. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel down before the Lord, our Maker. Our Maker. The God that made us. The God that gave us life and purpose and meaning. And more importantly, salvation. The God that gave us all those things. The story I told in the beginning was meant to talk about the idea that we as people are adaptable. That we can adapt to struggle and we can adapt to situations that are less than ideal. And when we get through that, we always learn something about ourselves in the end. And so I ask if you're here today and you have not become part of that. And you've heard the words, and you've heard the message, and this is the most important thing, no matter how good I am, no matter how much effort I put into this, that this is only a fraction of a percent of the ability that God has given me. And so if you're here today and if you've heard these words and you think, that's what I'm missing, that's what's missing, that's the key, that's how I'm going to figure all this out, that's how I'm going to figure out this life thing. If you're here today and you have not become part of that, the waters of baptism are available. If you're here today and you're already part of that, then you know that when I say, as funny as it was when I said, absolutely not, we're going to handle this all the time, that's because we don't have to handle it alone. That it is not up to any one of us, including myself. Myself who stands up here, who puts himself in a leadership position. I struggle with those things, so there's no shame in knowing that you struggle with something. And so if you're here today and you're already a Christian, but there's something that you're hanging on to, there's something that you've got to get through, then ask the congregation to pray for you, and ask me to pray for you. You can approach me separately, you can approach us together, but it's one of those things that we as people are adaptable, and we will get through these things ultimately, knowing that God has got our backs on us. And so, take that Dixie cup and make something out of it. Take that small, insignificant, completely disposable, never remembered object and make something out of it. And so in the same way, our faith can be crafted in the same way, that we can take the opportunity to create something with God that will last and that will increase in value. And that is so far beyond ourselves. And so I ask that if you're here today and you're contemplating any of those things, meditate on that, think on that, pray on that, as we stand and sing the song of invitation.
Sweetly, Lord,